Hello everyone. Thanks for coming first of all. Okay, I want to start in German, so when I can anyway, I want to switch to English, so now I start with English. So welcome to our book presentation of Professor Anwar Shaikh, who's already here. His new book, it came out in January, Capitalism, Competition, Conflict, Crises. I shortly wanted to introduce our initiative, so I just present you today's agenda. Shortly present the initiative, then Professor Schäfold will be also hosting the moderation. We'll give a short introduction to our today's speaker, and then Professor Shaikh will give his talk, and afterwards we're going to have a Q&A session. And afterwards, around 8:30, it's finished, but you can also stay here. We have some drinks, as you might have already seen when entering, and just join any discussion or personal discussion. I also wanted to say that tomorrow we're going to host a workshop with Professor Shaikh. We're going to talk about pluralist thinking in economics curricula. Professor Shaikh will also give a short lecture from his book, so if you want to get a kind of a flavor of how the seminars look like at the New School, you're very welcome to join in. So shortly presenting our initiative and what we actually do. Kritische Ökonomik. We founded the initiative, I think, 4 or 5 years ago. People changing, but the topic more or less stayed the same. I think everyone knows what we criticize or what we want to change here in economics curricula, but and this is also what Professor Shaikh obviously is going to talk about in his speech. However, I shortly want to say what we criticize, and then what we actually want to change and how we want to change it. So, I mean, as you might have seen or experienced in your studies, most economic teaching is basically dominated by one research program, which is neoclassical school, neoclassical theory. And what you might have also read, and what I found interesting is, I mean, of course, the Mankiw 10 Principles of Economics. And also what we criticize is actually the way it is taught. Because just looking at this example here from Mankiw's book, it's kind of the 10 Principles of Economics, which personally reminds me of the 10 Commands you also find in the Bible. Or like the 10 laws of how you should behave. And this really, when you read the Mankiw, just read it again from this angle, and it resembles a lot. So the way economics is taught in most universities is, well, a bit like a science, but more kind of a religion, where you're not allowed to criticize, and people do not criticize. Also, what we see, or what we experience during our studies, is that most economists do not engage actively with other social sciences. Just to prove this, an interesting paper published in 2014, The Superiority of Economists. If you look here, here's the American Academic Review, which is one of the most cited economics journals, and what you see is that they actually do not cite any other disciplines, or at least the two which are really closely connected to economics, politics and sociology. However, you see that the big two politics and sociology journals actually do cite the American Academic Review. So there's more engagement of these two disciplines with economics, but economics actually doesn't engage that much with the other two disciplines. Another recent study, which I hope you can see it, not so good, unfortunately, is a recent study by Frank Beckenbach. You might have heard about the Econ Watch program, and this is the study is called Econ Plus, where they actually asked people who teach economics different questions. And what we see here, it's in German, and whether or how they improve the statement that it's important that students are confronted with different concepts, different ways to solve problems in economics. And you see here that actually people who teach economics approve of this. However, when we remind ourselves of our current seminars, I mean, at least for myself, I was only confronted with 1 or 1.5 maybe, but not with several concepts. And also, it's said here that these teachers or professors in economics say that it's important to learn from other disciplines. You can see here in the dark blue, which is, okay, I approve the statement, you should engage with other disciplines. However, as we have seen before in the slide, they say it, but they don't do it. One other result of this, which I found quite interesting, of this study here, which motivates again our criticism, against mainstream economics is that they had to improve on what they teach actually in different curricula. So in the master program, in upper bachelor program or first year bachelor program, what you can see here is actually that apparently people actually teach more plural, or what they think is plural, in the master's program than in the bachelor program, which essentially tells us that intentionally bachelor students are only confronted with the mainstream or with one-dimensional thinking, which I personally find quite outrageous, that it's actually on purpose that bachelor students are only taught kind of the mainstream and not other concepts. And we also conducted 1 year ago actually an own study where we asked first year bachelor students about several issues, and what we found out is that first year bachelor students actually care about critical thinking and also real world relatedness, which is not that present in economic studies. And most of the people, or more than 50%, actually agree to the statement that critical thinking and real world relatedness is quite important for the study of economics. So after having presented what we criticize and what the current state is, what do we actually want? So what we want is pluralism in economics. Why? Because we think that science, and every science, not only economics, but also politics, sociology, where this is more present, should kind of engage in sorting, comparing, criticizing different concepts, different theories that strive to explain certain real-world problems. Accepting that actually all kind of theories are fallible, that you can only apply them on certain aspects, certain situations, but that you always criticize and compare different concepts and theories. We also think, and this is why we think that actually it requires a variety of perspectives to look at economic problems. So what we demand from the economic curriculum is pluralism of theories, so that we get taught or can research different kind of theoretical concepts. Also pluralism methods, so not just quantitative methods, or also different quantitative methods such as stock flow, consistent modeling, but also, of course, qualitative analysis, meaning looking into text, looking into history, and so on. What we also want is more interdisciplinarity, meaning engaging with other disciplines. When you study economics, actually, you don't hear that much about what's going on in the other departments in politics, sociology. Only when you go there for a purpose and sit in a seminar. There's not much engagement both in terms of feeding and research, not just change. And also, what we think is important is, of course, economic history and the history of economic thought. Like you have Professor Folien, the next person. So we are blessed at least by this side, but at other universities, obviously, you don't have any courses on the history of economics and also economic history, and this is what we want to change. So for the rest, before I hand over, I just want to urge you to join our movement, join our initiative. We're also part of Netzwerk Klassische Ökonomie, which you might know, which is kind of the umbrella movement in Germany. And you see here the map, which is from half a year ago. So there's some initiatives missing, unfortunately, but it's growing and growing. And I think we have now over 30 initiatives in different universities in Germany. And you see that there's really a need for a change in economics, and that students demand it more and more. So there's also a lot of newspaper articles which you might have seen also in the FATS and so on and ongoing, but change is not so much, so we really have to join forces here and demand changes in economics. And just for your information, these are our next events. So of course the workshop tomorrow, then we have our jour fixe, which is always Thursday, in the seminar house at 6 p.m. And we also have the political economy in movies, which is an autonomous tutorium where you're very welcome to join in. And on the 21st of December, we're going to screen again. You might know, I mean, you're always welcome to see it again. And we're also going to have a discussion between or with Professor Klü from the University of Darmstadt. Kind of moved away a little bit from mainstream economics, which is going to be interesting. And also someone from well, actually, the finance world, Unemeyer, who's a journalist. And that's going to be quite interesting, I think. So, with this, with the next preceding events, I will hand over to Professor Sheffield, and thanks again for being here.
Well done, thank you very much. I have the pleasure of introducing the talk by my old friend Anwar Shaikh, and to give a few pieces of information. That is what I should like to stress, first of all, of a remarkable consistency over several decades. He is professor of economics at the graduate faculty of the New School in New York City. He is, to describe it in official terms, a professor of economic theory, and is especially concerned with empirical verifications of the theories. He's well known for having his own special relationship with Marx and Marxism. This has been the case, one might say, almost from the start. It means that he works on Marx as an analytical economist, developing the theory and not treating it as a kind of religion, as a kind of doctrine where you would like to confirm every word the master has spoken, but at that kind of distance which is necessary in a scientific endeavor. His early youth was quite moved. He moved from between many places, but he graduated from high school in New York in '61. He then studied at Princeton University, did some practical work, and took a PhD at Columbia. In 1972, he joined the economics department at the graduate faculty. He has been involved with political currents of the left, always with this special emphasis on sound, theoretical and empirical research. And he has, as such, had his relations with a number of important economists of the same orientation of the older generation, like John Robinson, Piero Sraffa, Luigi Pasinetti. And as a pupil, in the larger sense of the word, he studied the classics and is also a specialist in the history of economic thought. Of his papers, which are many, so it's not just this book, there are other books which might be filled with collections of his papers. Of his papers, I should like to mention first the laws of production and laws of algebra, the Hamburg production function, a paper which also plays a part in my lectures on growth theory as an important contribution to the critique of the neoclassical production function. Then there are papers on crisis theory, falling rate of profit, a number of papers on Marxian economics, like the empirical strength of the labor theory of value, and also more applied papers on international trade, development, and even macroeconomic papers on inflation and unemployment. We have known each other now for, well, nearly 40 years. We met in Cambridge in the late 60s and were brought together, you reminded me of this today, by Joan Robinson. And it's not the first time that you have come to Frankfurt, but it's a long time since you came last. So we had here, for instance, once a meeting of the Political Economy Roundtable in which Gavignani also participated. That, of course, was on the old campus, and you have seen that in the meantime we have modernized quite a bit, but we remain faithful to our old concerns. So please take the floor.
Is my, I don't know where do I switch it on.
It's in the.
Oh, sorry. We could put it on here, I suppose. Okay. I think it's. Can you hear me in the mic? No.
Can you just turn a little bit? The microphone.
Any better? No? It's not. No. Okay, it's not. How about this? Can you hear me? Yes, okay. Well, thank you for inviting me to your new campus. It's good to see that so nicely laid out.
This microphone, I switched this off. So
No, I switched it on. It's on. It's on.
Where is it?
It's on. It's on. Just
at
on.
the end. No,
Yeah, it's all right. It's good.
Yeah.
The bottom.
It's good. It's,
Oh,
it's good. It's on.
It's on.
It's on. It's on. No worries.
Okay, like that? Yes? Okay. And thank to Professor Sheffold for his generous introduction. We do indeed go back a very long way. And it's a pleasure to see him again and talk to him again. It's always a high point of my visits here to spend a couple of hours talking about things that no one else can understand or possibly care about, but we do. I wanted to say something about where I teach, the graduate faculty of the New School for Social Research. It has a long-standing connection to Germany. Perhaps you all know it was the place where the refugees from in the 1930s went from Germany and France, and it became what was called the University in Exile for these people. My own mentor was Adolf Lowe, who was one of the refugees from Germany. It's social sciences only. It's a graduate program only. And we, in the social sciences, engage with each other in a specific sense that we not only hear each other's lectures, we have to, because we are small collegium, probably smaller than this in terms of the faculty. We sit in on each other's lectures. When I gave my book talk, there were people from all the social sciences, history, political science, psychology, sociology, and we also examine each other's PhD students. Now, I don't know if that's good for the PhD students, but it's very good for us because we learn what the other disciplines are talking about and we learn how to communicate with them. And we try to carry it over in my department, which is the economics department, to the way we teach. We require every student to have 2 semesters of the history of economic thought, beginning with Smith and Ricardo and Marx and Walras and Jevons Menger and Keynes, Kalecki. We have courses, we require everyone to study neoclassic economics, but also to study post-Keynesian economics and classical economics. It makes it a little bit harder, but it is much more interesting because it forces you to engage in the differences of the points of view. And this is important for me because this was my training. When you start teaching, you usually know less than your students, and hopefully before you die, you know a little bit more than your students, and that's the goal. And the range to which I was exposed as a young faculty member and as a colleague of all these, some very well-known professors in social science, helped me tremendously to understand what my question was. And as a person trained in economics, my first degree, as Professor Sheffield said, was in engineering, and then I got a degree my PhD in economics. I was always interested in economics as a way to understand the world, not as a religious exercise. And I think in my time it was in fact a way to understand the world. This was in the late 1968, 70. We occupied the buildings. I'm not suggesting you should do that, but it's a good way to sort of stimulate discussion and points of view. And we taught our own courses. My teacher of microeconomics was Gary Becker, Bill Vickery and Gary Becker, both of whom won Nobel Prizes in economics for microeconomics. But I never believed a word they said in terms of the theory. And that's despite the fact that they were clearly brilliant people, because coming as I did, traveling across different parts of the world, it seemed to me that the basic foundation, the characterization of human behavior and society was, if you forgive my saying so, completely absurd. Had no relation to how people do behave. And then it raises an interesting question: how can something like this dominate for so long if it is disconnected from its own object of investigation? With that, the purpose of my book is to analyze capitalism. That's why the title of the book is not about theory. It is about the analysis of the actual operations of capitalism. And so 50% of this book is empirical. And that took me a long time to show that the arguments can be applied. And I'm going to show you some of the patterns that need to be explained. So it's not a book on the history of thought. On the other hand, you will see that a good deal of reference is made to other thinkers in different traditions. Hayek, for instance, has a view of competition which is very similar to the classical one and quite different from perfect competition. Keynes and Kalecki, Wicksell on the interest rate. So you need to know these things. But my purpose was to show that there is a coherent line that can be extracted, or if you want, can be excavated from the long historical tradition of economics that makes a lot of sense, that is self-consistent all the way through, and provides different perspectives and some sense of different understanding on specific issues. I hope to come back to that when I'm talking about some of the applications. So let me say that the second purpose of this book is to stimulate thinking about an alternative curriculum. A curriculum that can run parallel. As I said, you need to know neoclassic economics, you need to know post-Keynesian economics, but this is an alternate curriculum that could run parallel, and I'll try and show you how, from micro to macro, and addressing the key issues, empirical patterns, and theoretical issues in the profession without any reference whatsoever to utility theory, maximizing, optimizing, rational choice, rational expectations. That's not because I ignore choice, it's because choice has to be understood in a different way. And I'm going to try to explain what I mean by that as I go along. So let me begin by saying there, in terms of the book has three basic, is in the book. It took me, this draft of the book took me 15 years to write. So, because when you encounter the things I was forced to encounter as a teacher and as a colleague at the New School, you have to see how they can fit in the overall framework. So, right away from the book, I reject the distinction between perfect and imperfect competition. And for me, that is an automatic rejection, because if you reject perfect competition, then imperfect competition is automatically rejected since it is a deviation from perfect competition. It is like saying that I reject, as I do, the idea of the Garden of Eden. I reject all of that story. But then by the same implication, I don't think the problem with the world is that we are imperfect. Obviously, the story that we tell about the world has to be related to how we actually came about, not this fictitious beginning. So in that sense, Darwin is a better place to start than the Bible. And talking about how some priests are not always as good as the Bible says is completely irrelevant. You have to understand how to analyze society and structure from that different foundation, and then you can talk about how institutions work. Now this means that I come into conflict with some of my post-Keynesian friends. At the New School Economics Department, I would say the majority of the faculty there are post-Keynesians, and I have many friends there, but I argue that we should not develop the analysis of micro or macro from a notion of imperfect competition. I'm going to try to talk about that, and I'd be happy to talk more about the fact that neither Keynes nor Kalecki required for their own theory of effective demand any reference to imperfect competition. Keynes, as we know, rejects that idea completely, and Kalecki's original formulation of the theory of effective demand was based on what he called pure competition. But then we have to explain what Kalecki explains. We have to show that the patterns he sees can be derived elsewhere, and that's one of the things I show in the book. So let me then begin with the thing that usually is not talked about in the heterodox tradition, which is microeconomics of consumer behavior. Now, I want to mention again that my teachers of microeconomics were Vickery and Becker, and Becker's course was a difficult course. We used to use harsher words for that, not because it was a bad course, it was really difficult. It was an excellent course. And then one day, Becker walked into the course, and he showed us that he can derive all the stuff that we had been forced to derive in the usual way, utility, maximizing optimality, without any reference to any of that. And I was stunned. It's an article he wrote in 1963, and I put that aside, and 40 years later, I picked it up again to show that I can use that same methodology to explain how microeconomics, the positive results of microeconomics, follow from any sensible theory of consumer behavior without any reference to optimality and all of that. Let me briefly, maybe it's this way. Oh, sorry, yeah. Sorry, before I get to that, I forgot to say that this is the structure of the book. It has actually 17 chapters. The 17th chapter doesn't fit on the slide, but it's the chapter where I talk about extensions and applications such as analysis of Piketty's work, econophysics, the role of the state, development economics, and so on. But the purpose here is to set up analysis of an alternate tradition, the applications to micro foundations is chapter 3, to consumer behavior. Part 2 is the theory of real competition, and part 3 is the theory of turbulent macrodynamics. So it's consumer behavior theory of the firm macro, but of course structured differently because it's a different approach. And I want to draw your attention to that red thing at the end about that every one of the chapters in the book is covered in video lectures, which I gave. One of the advantages of teaching at the New School is I can give lectures on stuff like this, and they pay me, which is quite extraordinary. And these lectures are available on the book website, which is called realecon.org. We also have there discussions, reviews of the books, discussions about using it, the attempts to make it into a curriculum. Different people at different levels are trying that. And I encourage you to go there because also all the data from the book is there. Every single piece of data that I use in the book, the sources, The derivations are laid out and the data is available in spreadsheet form, so you can use it, and if I have made mistakes, a la famous people from the IMF, then you will discover them, I'm sure. And I encourage you to take a look at that. I'm going to show you some basic long-run patterns, and the reason I show you that is that I want to get your attention away from the idea that this is about history of thought and towards the idea that this is about capitalism, advanced capitalism. I don't discuss in any depth the issues of development, though I point out how that can be applied, how that can be dealt with from this foundation. But I do discuss stock prices, bond prices, interest rates, exchange rates, trade patterns, profit rates, Kondratiev waves, and all of that analytically and empirically. And I show that there's a unifying element that produces these patterns, and that element is the one that the classical economists have already established, which is the idea of arbitrage being closed by movements of capital. If their prices are lower here, then customers gravitate over there. If profit rates are higher there than here, then capital gravitates there. If wages are higher there than here, then labor gravitates. And this gravitational thing should be thought of in the sense of the physics notion of drift and diffusion, not the idea of equality, but the movement towards it, because that movement creates patterns, and those patterns we can formalize and we can actually show exist. So that's an important point, that these are patterns that become clear, are logical and empirical consequences of just the basic approach. Let me now talk about the idea of the budget-constrained choice. This is a budget line, a la Becker, and the only thing I did to modify this budget line is to add a minimum level. So if you think of the space of commodities as a luxury good on the vertical axis, a necessary good on the horizontal axis, then since when I was taking Becker's course, I was also studying development, it seemed to me that the necessary good had to have a certain minimum amount, and that mathematically creates a nonlinearity, that's all. It's a threshold, but the main point is that then the feasible space is this heavy line, the solid line, in your choice. And the key point is the following. It can be shown that if any types of behavior create stable patterns, regardless of what that behavior is. Perhaps some of you eat what you eat because your parents do it, or you choose what you do because you come from a particular income class or region, or because your friends do it, or because your nationality influences it. It doesn't matter. If the results produce a stable pattern on the propensity to consume out of disposable income, and that's the only variable that matters, then you will have a point for the aggregate only, point A. Now, that doesn't imply that you are rational consumers, and I mean, anybody who's ever been to a football game cannot possibly believe that humans are rational. So you cannot make that, carry over that assumption. We operate on combinations of things, including fear and habit and influence of others and all that. That's well known. And as I said, one of the advantages of teaching at the New School is that my colleagues as psychologists and sociologists were there to talk about what we were talking about also. Given that minimal requirement, we can see, as Becker showed, that if you have a stable aggregate propensity to consume from this collective behavior, then if you increase the price of a good, let's say the necessary good, and you will then have less of the good available at the maximum level, the minimum is the same, you will shift the space, the feasible space from here to here, and you will get, of course, a downward sloping demand curve. You can also show that you can derive the elasticities of demand that are observed. You can derive Engels' law. The income elasticities on necessary goods are different than luxury goods. You can derive the Keynesian consumption function. I do that more formally in the book itself. But you can see that the main point is a simple one and easily established as reasonable from social behavior. We can therefore accommodate the influence of advertising and gender and race and nationality on our behavior, and yet also accommodate the empirical patterns, what are called in economic textbooks the positive side of microeconomics. I recently gave a talk in the New School in one of my colleagues' courses on microeconomics, and I noticed that Mas Kollel's book, the first 100 pages, derives some patterns, and then he says, well, these are positive patterns. They can be derived from any point of view, which, however, he doesn't allow you to do. They don't allow you to do. But from now on, the book says we must talk about the meaning of these choices, and for that we need optimality, rationality. No. That's like telling me that I've just found a bunch of fossils and I can explain them perfectly well, but now I need to explain their meaning, so let me go to the Bible. And that makes no sense to me at all. No. I'm not a Christian anyway, but that's besides the point. So if we do that, then here's an interesting implication of that. In the book, we built, with the help of a student, Amar Ragab, 4 agent-based simulation models. And they were built so that they would be completely contrary to each other. One was a neoclassical agent, all alike, so that every agent is also the representative agent, and utility functions with different budget lines, maximizing, optimizing, and all that, and they choose that way. The second one was neoclassical consumers, but with different utility functions, because then, as you know, there's no such thing as a representative agent, because they are different. And the third was agents who choose randomly. So whatever the menu is, they choose from it randomly. And the fourth was made up of 2 sets of agents that have different individual behaviors, but they tend to adjust their behavior towards those in their neighborhood, and a set of agents who tend to try to be different from those in their neighborhood. So I think the first set to adjust to people like yourself is older people, and the second set who want to be different is younger people. Now the point is that these 4 completely contrary models give you exactly the same demand curves. All 4 and the theoretical one are on this first diagram. That's the necessary goods demand curve, and the second is the luxury goods demand curve. And that is formally shown as a necessary result from the assumption of stability of consumption behavior in the propensity to consume only. But this makes it clear that we do not need to be tied to the standard framework in order to understand what actually happens. Now suppose you say to me, okay, after that's happened, I surely would need to be able to say, how do people feel? And yes, that's quite correct. But to say that people feel the way that the theory tells us, orthodox theory tells us, it to me makes no sense. Donald Trump understands how people feel. If you want to know how people feel, ask him. He's better at it than most. The next best would be people who do PR work, which is public relations work. They know how to advertising, all of that kind of thing. That is how people react. Anyone who says, for instance, that talks about Pareto optimality, if I select one person here and give them more money but don't take anything from anyone else, everyone will be, that's a general Pareto improvement. It's ridiculous. It's absolutely false. People care about what other people are. If that person happened to be Donald Trump, I might feel a lot more unhappy than I'm already feeling. Other people might feel more happy, but it's absolutely impossible to say that it's a neutral result. It's and we get sucked into that by having the assumptions repeated and repeated and repeated until we forget what the point is. Mathematics is, by the way, not the villain here. My book uses some mathematics. I wrote it with a minimum amount because I wanted it to be accessible to people who are not economists. But I do, as Professor Scheffel pointed out, I do a fair amount of it myself. I'm working on econophysics myself now. Very interesting stuff. But the point is, you can't blame the mathematics for the underlying theory. That's like blaming Latin for the Bible. You can't do that. It's not Latin's fault, though the Bible may well be taught. The liturgy may well be in Latin. So this is some basic patterns that I want to run through. Industrial Production Index in the United States, starting in 1860, and all my data goes to 2010, 2011, because the book was in process, so to speak, long enough. And the main thing you notice is that capitalism, where it's successful in the center, grows, but it grows in a turbulent manner, not at a steady state or anything like that. It has an underlying dynamic which needs to be explained, and this turbulence is a central part of it. This is the real investment index from 1832 to 2010, and again you see growth, but you see turbulence. And some of these events here, this is the Great Depression of, that's right here, the Great Depression of the 1840s, where in Germany it was particularly bad. Two young postdocs, not suggesting you should make this your application after you get your PhD, but called Marx and Engels were in the streets trying to overthrow, in Engels' case, the German government, in Marx's case, the French government. Another event here, the Great Depression of 1930s, and I'm going to come back to that. They're more circumstantial, but the main point is you also see that investment is more volatile than output. One of the fundamental points that Keynes makes, but everybody who's ever studied these things made. Wesley Clare Mitchell, one of the founders of the New School, Marx, anybody who's studied these things understands that that comes from certain properties of the fact that investment is a much longer reaching activity than production, and therefore has to accommodate a lot more uncertainty. This is the third aspect, which is central capitalism in the center at least, which is that real GNP per capita rises. Capitalism produces wealth on average, and that's precisely why the wealthy countries are a place where poorer people desperately wish to go in certain time, because they are not just safer, but they're also richer. And that richer wealth was created by capitalism itself, and that's a central point. This is business cycles which were put together by the Cleveland Trust Company. And you might ask, why does a bank, Cleveland Trust Company, care about business cycles? And the answer is obvious. They lend you money, they'd like to know if it's coming back. And the way to do that is to get some sense whether they're sitting on top of a precipice or they're rising up again. So this is in this wonderful book by Leonard Ayres called Turning Points in Business Cycles. And it is their data. And you see, again, that the natural rhythm of the system is a turbulent fluctuation. It's not a sine wave or something like that, but it is a recurrence pattern. And the recurrence comes because this system balances itself by overshooting and undershooting. That's an important point. That is the mode of balance. You cannot take out that balancing part and say, oh, look at equilibrium, because then you're missing the point, which is that it's the fluctuations that keep the equilibrium, the balance. Equilibrium never exists. It is only the counter, it's the average of overshooting and undershooting. That's the key point. Now here you also see an event which is the Great Depression, but that Great Depression in the 1840s, the ones I mentioned before, Marx and Engels. And then you also see that wars tend to be good for countries that win. The Mexican War in Mexico is called the American War because they rightly see themselves as being attacked. Now the next period, 1867 to 1902, again there's an event called the Great Depression. That was called the Long Depression. Sigmund Freud at that time is writing, worried about what his future is going to be like, what his family might be doing in case of war. So these are people caught up in that period, and we know this is called the Great Depression in the business cycle literature. And then you see the same patterns again of fluctuation. Then 1903 to 1939, and here you see again World War I, you see the fluctuations, and then you see this another event called the Great Depression of 1929 to 39. And this is, my point here is that not only cycles, erratic short-term fluctuations are recurrent, but so are the longer ones. And one of the things theoretically you need to be able to understand is why and what the difference is between those recurrent patterns. Here's another point which is very important. The blue line there is the compensation per hour in production workers of the United States from 1889 to 2010. And the dark black line is productivity. Now, if you look from 1889 to 1929, the two lines seem to move together. Then they diverge in the Great Depression. That's understandable. Productivity then picks up and rises faster than, real wages rise faster than productivity after the war. But then you see real wages in the 1980s onward stagnate, real wages of production workers, whereas productivity continued to rise. That is the foundation of the Trump phenomenon today. The people there who were displaced and stagnated in their incomes were exactly the working class people, white working class people especially, men more than women, and so on. Now my point here is that you might then casually say in the beginning, well, wages and productivity move together. That's marginal productivity theory or stylized facts if you are in Cambridge. But the fact is that this, as a social construction, what was undone in the 1980s was the institutional framework of the welfare state and of unions. We know this because there's a great deal of empirical evidence about this. So the relation between wages and productivity is socially constructed, and it is mediated by conflict. And that's why the remainder of my book, competition is the first element, but conflict is the second element. And in the book, I talk about how to analyze and how to show how the process of this balance of power shifts and what are the factors that are involved in it. Let me skip that. This is another issue again. Here is the unemployment rate. The data begins in 1890 because unfortunately we don't have data in the US going back before that. But you see the huge peak of the unemployment rate in the late 1890s, and that's the end of that depression called the long depression of the 1870s, 80s, and 90s. Then you see it fluctuates around 0.5. There's a drop in World War I, then a rise at the end of World War I, then this huge rise in the Great Depression. And that huge rise is 25%, the official unemployment rate. I'm sure you all know that unemployment is measured in the following way. If you work 1 hour in the past week, you are not counted as unemployed, you're counted as employed. That's how unemployment rates are measured. So all the official measures across the whole world are based on that. So you think 25%, what that means, that those people could not even get 1 hour work in the last week. Now, in this period, you see that there is another event which I consider a Great Depression, which is the Great Stagflation of the 1969, but then the peak unemployment rate is much lower. It only goes up to 10%. And then in the current economic crisis, which is at the end of that graph, the economic rate goes up to 10% or so again. Now, my point here is that unemployment and the recurrence of these crises is an intrinsic phenomenon. We'll come back again to those patterns. But the way they express themselves depends on the institutional and social framework. We did not allow the Great Depression, unraveling of the banks, the mass unemployment, for no other reason that was politically very dangerous. So it was suppressed, but then other consequences come about from that suppression. Recovery postponed, and the second, which is you stimulate to get inflation. Then failed. That a pattern by the industry. Now, this is the one which I very much like, which is the price level in the UK and the US from 1780 to 2010. If you look in the period from 1780 to 1940, you 1930, you notice something quite striking. You see waves. Those waves, especially if you smooth the data, are Kondratiev waves. That's where Kondratiev is data. The other thing is really that the end point in 1940 in the price level is the same as 1780. There is no secular inflation till the post-war period in any advanced capitalist country, except under special circumstances. War, we know, 1930s in Germany, 1920s rather in Germany, we know that. But the secular pattern in the advanced world does not come about until the 1940s. And we need to explain why it is that capitalism for such a long time did not have inflation as an intrinsic property, and then later did have inflation. So part of the book is a chapter explaining how inflation comes about, which is different from the conventional one, and then applying that empirically. We applied to, I think, 13 different countries and different time periods. Now, the waves that I talked about, the waves in this part, are actually in Kondratiev's book. Of course, he is executed by Stalin somewhere in here, so the data is obviously doesn't go any further. But what's striking is that in the back of Kondratiev's book, which is always good to read footnotes and appendices, by the way. My book has about a third of it is that. So, because a lot of detail is there. And Kondratiev had to make a choice on how to present his data. One was to use wholesale price indexes in local currency. So this is British pounds and US dollars indexes. But the other, in the back of his book, he has another set of data, which is in gold prices, that is in a universal world currency. And that data, unfortunately, he did not graph. And because graphing was so complicated and difficult, apparently needed than anyone else for a long time. But if you go back, if you graph the data, then you see the long waves beginning in 1780. You can see the waves. You can see, leaving aside the peaks that come from the war, long wave. And then after 1940, instead of the prices rising as they do if you express them in local currency, you see that they actually have the same recurrent pattern that they did before. In other words, Kondratiev was absolutely right about the timing of prices. And had he not made the mistake of presenting the data in terms of local currencies, had he done it in terms of gold currencies, Kondratiev would be part of every curriculum. It's worth going back and reading the book again to see. So, I don't know if I did it there, but I'm going to come back to it anyway. This is the profit rate of the US, and you can see that, leaving aside the obvious fluctuations, this big fluctuation is caused by the Vietnam War and the huge deficit spending for the Great Society, Lyndon Johnson. But you can see the downward trend, and then beginning in the 1980s, you see the profit rate is stabilized. How did that happen? Well, the graph I showed you earlier explains that. Productivity continued to rise, but wages were kept flat or rising slowly, and the difference creates a rising profit share, because the ratio of wages to productivity is a wage share. So if that's going down, the profit share is rising, and that stabilizes the profit rate. Another question which comes up in economic analysis a lot is the idea of equalization of profit rates. You should be, in the sense of Smith, prices which reflect equal profit rates are natural prices. Marx calls them prices of production. Sraffa works on these Sraffa prices, or the analysis of equal profit rate prices. If you look in the data for different different industries in the United States from 1960 to 1989, I have lots of other data in the book, but this is just illustrative. You can see that profit rates cluster around each other. This solid line, dark line there is the average, but they don't cross over. They don't equalize. Now, I emphasize in the book, the idea of equalization is a turbulent overshooting, undershooting, just like all the other patterns we've seen. You clearly see that it's not happening there. But that's because we're looking too abstractly. If you know how real competition operates, how the firm operates, then this data becomes easily explained because firms in the notion of real competition, firms set prices. The idea that they take prices has never been true. When you go into a shop, there's no Walrasian auctioneer running behind you adding prices to things. It's set by the seller, of course. Prices have always been set by the seller. Sellers compete with each other for customers, and lowering prices is one of the ways to do that. But you cannot gain an advantage in the warfare of lowering prices unless you have lower costs. So they have an intrinsic necessity to cut costs. And that means changing technology, mechanization, seeking out low-wage workers. All of that is an intrinsic part of what I call real competition. And in that case, you can see clearly that the profit rate equalization could not operate across all capitals. Let's suppose that side of the room are older machines and plant and equipment, and these are the medium ones and these are the new ones. Now, the profit rate in this industry is going to be examined from the point of view of new capital, new investment. I'm going to look to, first of all, to see how the newest ones do, because that's where I'm going to enter. I won't obviously enter with an old obsolete machine. And then I'm going to see if that profit rate is higher than other similar new ones. And that means that what gets equalized is the rate of profit on new investment. Now again, from a certain point of view, every economist says this. But when we do the empirical work, we forget that. You need to measure the profit rate on new investment. And that measure is provided actually fairly simply by Keynes and Caldor. Caldor specifically says that the profit rate on new investment is the change of profit divided by investment. Now if you take that measure, this is what you get. You get tremendous cycling back and forth. And we do it for different countries, different time periods, different industries, and you can see what makes sense is that the mobility of capital towards new applications creates pressure to bring the supply up relative to demand if the profit rate is high, and that brings the price down and brings the profit rate down, but not towards some equilibrium, but rather this constant fluctuation. And so this is the key point: turbulent equalization of profit rates on new capital. By implication here, when we look at industries, we would expect technologies to be different because new firms come in or new methods come in at the low cost level, and the old ones are gradually dying out. So from a biological point of view, you have birth and aging and death, and you're going to get a spectrum of different ages. Now this is something that's well known when you do empirical work, but people forget about that when they do the theory. It's very important if you're doing the empirical work to keep track of where you expect the action to be, so to speak. That point that the profit rate on new investment is the driver turns out to explain many different things. You can look at interest rates, stock market. I don't think I do that here, but let me see if I did or not. No. But the key point is that the rate of return on new investment is what Keynes calls the marginal efficiency of capital. It's exactly that. It's the expected rate of return on new investment, but this is the realized marginal efficiency of capital. And that provides a natural link and foundation to the theory of macrodynamics, because this is now grounded in actual, very detailed development. So, one thing, since I cannot resist digressing into Ricardo, we know that Ricardo argued that the difference between prices of production, natural prices, prices that reflect equal profit rates, and direct and indirect labor times, or more generally direct and indirect unit labor costs, because if the wages are the same, then unit labor cost ratios are the same as labor time ratios, because the unit labor cost is the wage times the amount of labor. So the wage cancels out. And you can calculate for the US and any country that put out the tables this number. This is on this axis you have prices of production, or natural price in the sense of Ricardo. And on this axis you have direct and indirect unit labor costs, which are the empirical equivalent of Ricardo's total labor time. And what you see is that the difference between the two is small. And indeed, in the book, I show that that difference is on the order of 8 to 10%, which is exactly Ricardo's hypothesis, the famous 93% theory of price. And the reason for that is a mathematical and logical one. You can break price into two components, a structural one, which is direct and indirect unit labor costs, and a distributional one, which is a ratio of direct and indirect profit to direct and indirect costs, labor costs. And that the second one turns out to have mathematically and empirically second order small implication for prices. You can explain 95% or 90% of the variation of relative prices over time by simply their direct and indirect or vertically integrated unit labor costs. And that's an important point for empirical work. I'm going to skip that. I also have an explanation for the Phillips curve, which I'm going to just briefly talk about. The Phillips curve was originally a curve of wage changes in the wage rate versus unemployment, and it worked for about 10 years when it was as in that form, the inflation Phillips curve, and then simply stopped working. So the more data you had, if you expanded the data set to the 80s and 90s, you began to see that the Phillips curve disappeared. Now this caused huge problem. It was part of the cause of the demise of Keynesian economics, which could not explain inflation anymore because there wasn't a trade-off. But the question that Phillips asked was not about inflation, it was originally about wages. And you can find that if you change that question and look at wages and wage shares, the Phillips curve that original Phillips curve is right there. It's clear and visible. You can see it in the data. People just didn't look. But if you ask the question about inflation, then you come into a issue. I point out in the book that there's an argument going back to Marx and formalized by Goodwin, which is that the system reproduces a pool of unemployed laborers. And that can be empirically shown also. If the labor supply is tight, then there's an incentive to bring in labor from elsewhere, to persuade people who are not working to enter the labor force, and to mechanize more rapidly so you displace labor with more capital-intensive technology, and that pulls the pool back on. So then you have a problem, a theoretical problem. If unemployment is endogenous and is recreated, then it cannot be a long-term limit to the growth of the system, because the supply of labor is, so to speak, expanded through a variety of things. I mean, Germany obviously importing Turkish workers, United States Mexican workers, and Latin American workers, and so on. These are the oldest aspects of capitalism in terms of the employment pool. Well, then how can you explain inflation if the growth of the responsive output is not limited by labor? The Keynesian argument has two dimensions to it. One is that creation of new demand pulls on every firm's production, and it expands its production if it can, but if it starts to reach into limits, then prices rise. So then the question is, what's the supply limit? Where's the resistance coming from? And here you go back to an old answer, which is in Ricardo already, which is that no system can grow faster than if you put all of the surplus product back into it. Now, the ratio of the surplus product to the inputs is the profit rate. So no system can have a growth rate which is higher than the profit rate. This was rediscovered in Marx and the schemes of reproduction. If you follow the logic of his expanded reproduction, it necessarily follows. And it was rediscovered by von Neumann, showing that the maximum balanced growth rate was the profit rate. Passanetti shows, one of my teachers, Passanetti shows that as you approach this limit, you get more and more bottlenecks. That's the clue. If your growth rate gets closer to the profit rate, then you get more and more bottlenecks. And this then provides a simple explanation for what happened in the Great Stagflation. In the 1960s and 70s, the state was intervening to lower the unemployment rate by stimulating by macro policies, by stimulating demand, government deficits, making credit easier, and so on. And that stimulus would lower the unemployment rate. And then the unemployment rate would come back. It would produce some inflation, and the unemployment rate would then be a greater stimulus, and the unemployment rate would go down, then it would come back up. And that recurrence of an unemployment rate is what Milton Friedman seized upon. He called it the natural rate of unemployment, and he said inflation came because you were trying to reduce the unemployment rate below the natural rate. But from another way of looking at it, what you're doing is increasing the demand for output, which increases the demand for labor, which increases the wage share. And as the wage share increases, the profit share falls. So the profit rate, which is a ceiling, is falling. At the same time, the actual growth rate is rising because you're stimulating. You're narrowing the gap between the two. And therefore, if you were to look at inflation versus the unused growth capacity, you should get a different picture. And I show that, in fact, you do get a very different picture. This is inflation here, but instead of unemployment here, I have 1 minus the growth capacity. This is the unutilized growth capacity, and you can see this pattern. And you also see that the story is not reducible to just that kind of trade-off, because of course it depends on the degree to which you're stimulating the system by creating aggregate demand and deficit spending. So a very simple model of inflation, in which inflation depends on two variables. One is the stimulus, which is the excess, the creation of new demand, which you can measure, by the way, there's data on this. And the other is the resistance of supply, which is the tightness, the distance between the growth rate, the profit rate, and the growth rate. That model, expressed in nonlinear form, can explain actual inflation in the United States in a very simple way. And this is not Nehru. This is, I don't know, I don't have a good word for it, but this is essentially the Ricardian and Neumann hypothesis about the growth rate. Okay, so I'm not going to show you that. I'm running out of time. Well, maybe I'll show you that. It's so cool. This is the Phillips curve as it could have been had Phillips asked a different question. Phillips asked, what's the influence of the rate of change of wages, of unemployment on the rate of change of wages? So if unemployment is bigger, then you'd expect workers would be less able to increase their wage, and so therefore you'd be having a downward sloping curve. And he found it, by the way. But he looked at money wages. He could have looked at real wages, because from a classical point of view, the variable that you want to look at is wages relative to prices. That's a standard of living that workers are fighting for. Or he could have looked at the wage share, because from the point of view of Marx, the struggle between capital and labor takes place in the division of value added. Those three give a different picture. This is the wage share, that's on this axis, and the dividing line is 0. So anything above that is rising wage share, and below that is falling wage share, and here is the unemployment rate adjusted for the duration of unemployment. That's very important, because in the neoliberal era, the unemployment rate, which only measures this 1 hour of work a week kind of measure, doesn't take into account the fact that people were unemployed for much longer. So I make that adjustment. And this is how the actual path of the US economy, beginning at the end of the post-war period. This is HP filtered data. 1949, the wage share is increasing at about 1% a year, but that rate is falling as the economy cools off after the war, and it keeps falling. So the wage share is moving, like any good nonlinear Goodwin model, towards 0. But unlike a Goodwin model, in the real world politics matters, and here comes the Vietnam War. And you see the pumping up of the economy. It essentially moves up the same curve until the peak of the Vietnam War, So now the wage share is beginning to rise, the profit share is falling, the profit rate is falling relative to its trend, and then the peak of the Great Society, Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, and that is around 68, and then as that stimulus, fiscal stimulus, dies out, the economy moves back down the same curve. So far, we've had a 13-year round trip on the same curve, and that curve is holding for the whole post-war period, and it resumes its path towards this Goodwin destiny, and it goes past it, as one would expect. It would overshoot. But then, again, unlike Goodwin and any other formal models that we make, in the real world, something else happens, which is that Reagan has come into power, much like Trump on the same reaction, and he smashes unions, smashes the welfare state, weakens labor, shifts the balance of power, and you move away from that old curve to what turns out to be a new curve. And here, beginning in 1993, the new curve is now stimulated again by the dot-com bubble, which peaks in 1999, and then when it dies out, you come back down. Now, of course, I do this econometrically. I don't want you to think I'm not an economist, but the graph is clear enough. The shift in balance of power shifts the ability of workers to raise their wages relative to productivity, and that is a symptom of the weakening of the strength of labor in the new historical climate. So, methodologically, we have a question: how do we deal with data like this? One thing is clear: we can't speak about equilibrium because the processes are all turbulent and also conditional on historical events. So we have to know history, we have to know politics, we have to know psychology, we know how people behave, we have to be able to incorporate that into the story itself. And therefore the story has to have room for that. I don't believe that the long period method, which we often use, is valid in this case because that implies everything else can be extracted from. It's a good analytical space, perhaps, but it's not a descriptive space because that's not where the economy is. Therefore, you need nonlinear dynamics, you need stochastic tools. As I said, econophysics is a very interesting branch now. And you also have to understand that in consumer behavior, aggregates are different from the behavior of the individual. This is an obvious point now. It's been rediscovered. It's now called complexity theory, but in my day it was called dialectics. And it's basically the idea that you can't assume that a whole is just the sum of its parts. Interacting parts create a different set of properties than the individual elements. That's such an obvious point, but it's often forgotten. And the whole notion of a representative agent is therefore meaningless because the representative agent gets around that difficulty by assuming that the agent reflects the economy as a whole. You can speak of an average agent, that's not a problem. But the average agent, by definition, is the interaction of all the parts, so it's just the average of the whole. You're not telling anything new by dividing by the number of agents. The behavior is different. And you also have to, therefore, talk about the political action, the role of agency, meaning not just individual choosing among alternatives, but individual choosing to change the alternatives. That's a very important part of political and social agency. And lastly, winners and losers. The whole point of the theory of real competition, which I emphasize, is that the analogy there is competition is a war. It's not a ballet. You don't dance around optimality and then finally settle down, give you a swan song and die, but you settle down there. It's a war. And as such, they're winners and losers. They must be winners and losers. And that's, any business will tell you, that's how competition works. 50% or more firms fail within the first 7 years. And this is in the United States in the good years before the crisis. And that's normal. That's absolutely normal. Okay. The third point then, to tie this back in for Keynes in macrodynamics, if the incremental rate of profit is the marginal efficiency of capital. And then you have to understand how pumping up the demand of a system can create higher employment, can tighten the labor market, can make wage shares rise, can make profit rates fall, and therefore can cause unemployment to come back up in a different way, and also inflation if you keep pumping it. Now, in the book, I show the kind of dynamics one can get when you take Keynes's idea that investment depends on the difference between the profit rate and the interest rate. And you look at variables concretely, what determines the interest rate, how it moves, how that difference moves. You can see why you get the patterns that you do. I even show that the crisis of 2008 came exactly on Kondratiev's schedule. That is, if you filter the data I showed you, you just project from the two before 2008, which I used to do in my courses beginning around 2003, I'd say to my students, look at this pattern. If the last two cycles hold, then about 8 or 9 years after the peak, we will have another crisis. And I started saying this in 2003. And the crisis came actually 2008 rather than 2008 or 9. It came 2007, 2008. That's a very primitive tool, but it makes us think about why the system has recurring patterns. And that is because, despite all of its transformations, the driving force is at the micro level is profit. People get jobs because the people hiring them wish to have profits inside the state. The state gets its revenue from taxes and deficits within certain limits. Demand for consumer goods comes from the jobs that people get and dividends that the owners of capital, financial capital, asset capital get. That's Piketty's issue. So you can map all of these things back down to this very key root cause, which is the dynamics of profitability. And that dynamics has a tremendous set of moving channels that influence what the system can do and what it cannot do by implication. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anwar, for Thank you very much, Anwar, for an extremely stimulating lecture with a really surprising number of remarkable new insights. On the one hand, regarding the way in which you position yourself between, let's say, Marx and post-Keynesian theory, also methodologically, how you try to define a new methodology which gets away from the kind of equilibrium economics which is, after all, in the revival at that round table on. And on the other hand, we have these quite detailed new insights into certain macroeconomic regularities, which, like in the book by Piketty, begin to shift our attention from these post-Keynesian theories which were trying to stabilize facts towards new paradigms. I could try to isolate what seemed to me the most remarkable points made here, but I feel that the audience should get the opportunity to ask the first question. Please.
That's a risk for me. I'm not an economist and I cannot follow anything which is somehow connected with mathematics. Nevertheless, I want to ask a question. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can. Yeah.
When I studied sociology, I've been drinking with some economists post Keynesian economists, they told me, well, we are very optimistic. One day, politics will understand that the central bank is an institution which can be, which can do things, and maybe there's an endogenous supply of money, and when their credit is needed, and the central bank is providing this credit, and when fiscal policy of the state is supporting this money policy, then we will overcome crisis. And the problem for me as a sociologist would be to explain these economists why are people too stupid not to understand that such a policy is needed. A Keynesian macroeconomic policy where you have to take care of the money supply and of the demand side. And I've been somewhat skeptical, but I didn't have an answer. So the question to you, are you optimistic? Can there be a good capitalism if people are smart enough to apply cool politics? And what would you say is the role of money in the central bank? Because this is something I've missed in your lecture. Have I made myself understood?
Indeed.
Okay,
Indeed.
cool. Okay.
Well, first of all, I should say that in a lecture of this scale, it's really hard to cover the 1,000 pages of the book. So there's an extensive discussion of that issue in the theory of money and the theory of inflation, and particularly a discussion of the what's called modern monetary theory idea that money can be handled by the central bank and that fiscal policy can expand the system to any desired level of employment. My first point is that the idea that money is endogenous is not new. One of the originators of that idea is this old guy named Karl Marx. He spends a great deal of his argument saying that money is endogenous even when you have gold, so it's not a new discovery. The question is, what does it mean about credit and the ability to regulate credit and through interest rates and fiscal policy effective demand? Here the key point for me, and I show this empirically, is that if you stimulate the economy, which you can clearly do, and you have to formalize and show mathematically and empirically how that's possible, you run into the problem that if you do so in such a way that causes the wage share to rise, you're putting downward pressure on the profit rate, which means that as the profit rate falls, certain number of firms cease to exist and growth slows down. So you get a pumping up of the system. The growth path is growing, and you pump up the system is growing faster, but so it rises to a new level. But if the growth rate is lower, then you're growing more slowly than you were before, and at some point you pay the piper for that transfer of growth into levels. That can be shown formally, but it also can be shown empirically. That was the point of this movement, that the pumping up the system will run into that problem if it is transcends the limits, so to speak. Now, historically, countries like Sweden had developed rapidly from being a relatively country, in part by managing this contradiction, which is to say increasing wages, increasing employment, but also increasing productivity so unit labor costs stay down. That is a problem that Greece was not able to resolve that way. And therefore it has the difficulty right now that it can maintain the employment as it did by deficit spending and so on, but it cannot then also transcend the limit of profitability because the unit labor costs are higher. And that's one of the key complaints about. So am I optimistic that capitalism can do this? No. I can think of some countries can do it because competition also is war, and these unit labor costs are competing with each other. So I'm pessimistic on a world scale because I'm very worried about the huge number of unemployed people across the globe. I come from Pakistan originally, and when I look at the globe, that's what I look at. And I see this mass of people who are being displaced by robotization and mechanization, the very things that keep unit labor costs low in the center. And I don't have an easy answer to that. I wish I believed that if people were unemployed, they'd all become socialists, but as Donald Trump has shown, that's not how it works. So I see that as a very serious, difficult issue. Having said that, some countries may be able to thread their way through this path, as they've done historically. We need to know how the system operates if you're going to see if you can steer it. My early degree was in aeronautical engineering, and the one thing I learned is that you cannot just build a rocket and hope that when you get halfway to Mars, you'll figure out what to do when you're there, because you will not live long enough to tell anyone about it. You have to anticipate all the probabilities and possibilities as best as you can, be prepared for alternatives, and there's nothing better than the study of history to understand the problems that can be faced. I forgot one thing, post-Keynesian economics. As I said, most of my friends are post-Keynesian, but I show in the book that the thing that motivated post-Keynesian economics in Kalecki was the idea that if you look across firms, you see prices are different. And you see profit margins are correlated with costs. And this led him to say that this is not perfect competition, which is quite true, and therefore it's due to monopoly. But I make the point in the book that if you look at a dynamic model of competition itself, imagine that you had only one type of firm. A new firm comes in. That firm comes in and makes space for itself in the market, to use Marx's phrase, also the same phrase used in the Harvard Business Review, by lowering its price and announcing that it's on the scene. Then that lower price can only work if it has a lower cost, because the others can match. And they'll be in a destructive competition, but there's no particular advantage. So the new firm has to come in with the ability to cut with the lower costs. But that means already there are now two methods. Now this process is not something that takes place in textbook time. It takes place in real time. So even the new firm, which is now the lower cost firm, will in its lifetime be superseded by yet another one. And so you're going to get a spectrum of cost structures and new entrants. And what does a new entrant do? According to the Harvard Business Review, they cut their costs, they cut their prices. Then the others have a choice. The older ones can match, but if their costs are high enough, they'll have negative profits, or they can hope that customers will leave slowly. So they lower their prices a little bit, but not as much. If they lower it partially, and in response, you get a correlation between profit margins and cost structure, exactly Kalecki's finding. Moreover, the newer firms will tend to be more capital intensive, because that's how you lower your costs. So you'll get a correlation between profit margins and capital intensity. Kalecki's observation. But that follows from simply tracing through the dynamics of real competition. It has nothing to do with perfect or imperfect. Since perfect competition doesn't exist, neither does imperfect competition. You need to have a framework to explain the real process. And I spend a lot of time in the book talking about how we can incorporate the empirical evidence of post-Keynesian theory into the framework of real competition. Then the other side is effective demand, which is already, Keynes has shown, can be clearly located within the idea of real competition. In the Keynes' theory of the firm, which I discuss in the book, is absolutely consistent with what I'm calling real competition, and what we would have called real competition. Keynes, unfortunately, didn't read Marx. He read many things, but as he's on record saying, he never could make any sense of Marx. So that part doesn't appear. So I think there is a unified way to proceed that can make sense of history, of politics, of sociology and psychology of people behave, and of the observed dynamics of competition and warfare. Now, I've done the best I can to try and put it together, and I encourage people to at least consider it as an alternative.
Thank you. Thank you. My microphone seems to have been
Yes, I don't know, it's too late maybe, I switched off.
All right, I do not want to spoil the fun, but I must say that the story told by Marshall about the competition between firms is not so different from what you just said now.
I agree. But the textbook story is different. That's a big problem. But not Marshall's thing in the turbulent, like something floating down a turbulent stream. That's quite correct.
Yes. Okay. So another question. Yes, please.
In one of your slides, you showed that since the 70s there was an increasing gap between productivity and the labor at the real wage.
Real wage, right.
And when I saw this, I first thought that probably the company owners are benefiting from it. And then you showed the slide where the profit shares were actually stable over this period. And I was wondering who's benefiting from this gap?
Okay, a very good question. I didn't show, what I showed is this. You can see here in the beginning of the Reagan-Thatcher neoliberal era, well named and identified, you can see that productivity continues to rise and real wages become stagnant. These are the real wages of production workers, but pretty much real wages of all kinds of workers follow a similar pattern. Now, what does that mean? The profit rate was declining up to that point. But then the profit share begins to rise because of this movement, and that causes the profit rate to stagnate. So I didn't show the profit share here, but the profit share is exactly the dual of that. If productivity is rising faster than wages, the profit share is rising. And that's in the book, I just didn't bring it up for the slides. So the answer is there was a revolt by capital. There was an attack, systematic, collective attack across the world against the rising influence of the welfare state and the rising strength solidly set strength of labor. That early period here is called, at least in the US textbooks, the golden age of labor. Strong institutions, good unions, high standard living, and that's precisely where the profit rate is falling. And this could be viewed as the golden age of capital. Profit rate is stabilized, and the profit share is rising. Why is the profit rate stabilized because of that? Because the maximum profit rate, the rate of the output capital ratio adjusted for inflation, keeps falling steadily throughout the whole post-war period. And I show that in the book, and I show how it's measured and all the relation to national income accounts and all that, but it's a pretty steady, so the profit rate is being pulled down by, you can think of it as the capital output ratio is rising, the profit rate is being pulled down, but now the profit share is rising, so the two cancel each other out and you get this stable profit share. Growth is, however, not dependent on profitability alone, is dependent on the difference between the profit rate and the interest rate. I mentioned that just in passing, but that's very central to Marx and Keynes. Both say that the interest rate provides the benchmark for investment. If I think I can only make as much as by leaving my money in the bank, which is the interest rate, 5%, then I'm not going to take a risk of investing. So there has to be a sufficient gap between these two. And that gap determines, so to speak, the animal spirits of investment, of the capitalist investors. That gap was tremendously widened. And I don't have that data in this set, I don't think, but because, I have to go through this whole thing, sorry. No. Because what happened beginning in the 80s was also that the interest rate was lowered. So the profit rate is stable, but the interest rate is lowered. The gap between the profit rate and the interest rate rises, and you get a real boom. A boom that creates higher employment, it reduces the unemployment rate. All of those things can be understood from the historical and political moments, but notice that all of this is coming in the context of the theory of competition, not because firms just set whatever profits they like or that state can determine the system in any way. The state has to ride this tiger. And in the 80s it rode it well. In the process it created a speculative boom of totally enormous proportions across the whole world, and that led to the collapse in 2008. So the solution to the problem of stagnation from the 1970s was reducing the wage share, lowering the interest rate, but that's precisely what gave rise to the crisis of 2008. As I said, exactly on schedule, which is another very interesting fact, empirical fact.
A diagram of productivity and rising wages, which then all of a sudden stop rising and productivity goes on rising, is really very striking. And your explanation is essentially one, if I understand you properly, in terms of power relationships. Now, what surprises me in this context is why do the trade unions get so weak all of a sudden? I mean, you link this to Reaganomics, and certainly there were institutional changes, but historically speaking, it's an unprecedented, almost unprecedented divide. And it's not so obvious why all of a sudden the labor unions, which after all have their strong institutions should by themselves, have become so much weaker only because of some laws which after all, by taking industrial action, they might have influenced. So I am a bit surprised how this could happen. Is it a specifically US phenomenon?
Well, no, because the same thing happened in England. Thatcher did a very similar thing for the UK, but not as extensive, which is the dismantling of the welfare state, the attack on this idea of the government being something that could regulate capitalism, and in Reagan's case, specifically an attack on labor. I mean, Reagan persuaded, as Trump has now, persuaded the working class that unions were bad for them, because they were causing all these problems and causing unemployment and restrictions, and they'd get more jobs if they didn't have these restrictions. Also, unions were concentrated in certain segments, and others coming up were outside of those unions, and that provided an entry into that. The key thing was this attack on the idea that the state and unions are essentially interfering with the productive potential of capitalism. That's Milton Friedman. That is also the ideology of almost every Nobel laureate in those years, saying that the market is best if it's left to itself. Exactly the opposite of Keynes, by the way. And Keynes lost that battle ideologically also. In the case of the US, the number of people in unions shrank dramatically, and unions tried desperately to expand, but were not able to. They weren't able to even persuade workers to join them. And the fact that unemployment insurance was cut, that support for people who didn't have jobs was cut, welfare was cut, that's Bill Clinton's great innovation. All of this weakened the ability of the state to intervene and for other actors to intervene, and gave huge amount of power. Also in the US, don't forget, politics is much more driven by money than almost any country in the world, and this was a big shift towards, legally, towards the idea that big money could give money to politicians to elect them. And we see the consequences of that now. But I think much the same happened in England, actually, much the same.
Yes, please.
In your presentation, in your presentation, you always refer to many different aspects, but and sometimes in passing you refer to Pakistan, industrialization, and people that are being laid off. In general, but I didn't see that you refer to the organic composition of capital and to the increasing share of capital, especially, which is usually referred in many cycles of theories about crisis cycles. And I don't know if you treat it in the book or.
Yes, I do. But I treat it in the following context. I make the observation that if you look even in the business literature, you will see that the idea that the firm has to lower its cost, and one of the ways it can lower its cost is by shifting to new technology. That cost lowering is, from our point of view, lowering the average variable cost curve. It's the prime costs which are lowered. But the cost of lowering prime costs is usually bigger scale of production and more capital-intensive production. Businesses take this to be so obvious that they show you the new average cost curve just shifts down, but the average fixed cost curve shifts up. The sum of the two must be a lower average cost curve. And that is a generic drift coming from the fact that one of the ways you can endogenously lower costs is to build bigger scale and more capital-intensive technology. The other way, of course, is to open up the world for capital to move, but even then, when it moves, say, to China to make iPhones, it doesn't do it by labor hand thing. It uses the most advanced technology and the lower wages, so it gets a double benefit. Now that leads me to the idea that there, and I discuss this about the choice of technique as being a kind of stochastic process in which the probability of a lower cost, average cost, is associated with the probability of a higher fixed cost per unit capital. And that creates a certain expected pattern, which is that the average fixed cost per unit output or capital output ratio, organic composition, will drift upward. And I show in the book that's exactly what happens in the whole post-war period. In the process, it is important to know how to measure capital, which has changed in the 1980s. And here I make the point that you want to adjust output and capital for inflation. And the way you do that is a la Srafa, is to measure the output in terms of current prices and the capital stock in terms of current prices, because then the ratio of the two is a number without dimension, and it is inflation adjusted because the current prices reflect whatever the level of inflation there is. And when you do that, it's a simple measure, it's available, it's called the current cost capital output ratio. You see that rises steadily through the whole post-war period, and that undermines the profit rate. So the rise in the wage share, which diminishes the profit share, is a double factor. It undermines the profit rate even further. And that's why the profit rate is initially falling through the whole post-war period and then stabilizes. But it doesn't rise because the capital output ratio is still rising through the whole post-war period. Please.
Question about your graph with the rate of change of wage share and the unemployment, because what do you think is the story behind it? Is there causality between these two, or is there something third leading to both, like technical improvements that lead to this graph, or is there like a causality that says, like, if you have a higher unemployment, the rate of change of wage share decreases, or the other way around? Because from if the rate of the wage share decreases, also the labor share needed to produce decreases. So you could say, from an emancipatory point of view, you could say that's kind of a good thing, that we need to work less to produce the same amount. And do you think there's a possibility within capitalism to say we have a decrease of wage share and a decrease of unemployment at the same time? So like a point very much on the left, low on this graph.
Okay, I'm not sure I fully understood it, but let me just say something and you can correct me in here. The idea that rise in unemployment lowers the strength of labor As Marx puts it, it puts a check on the pretensions of labor, that's his phrase, that increasing unemployment reduces the ability of labor to bargain. And that reduced bargaining ability shows up as a wage share which is either rising less rapidly or stagnating or falling. That's a more concrete condition, depends on what else is happening at the macro level and so on. But what these curves show, which is quite striking, is that this is Phillips' original question. The rate of change of the wage share, subject to a particular institutional framework, has a trade-off between it and the degree of unemployment. And that says that that is a direct correlation in the classical sense of the reserve army of labor. The higher the pool of unemployed people, or the longer the duration of unemployment, the weaker they are in terms of the bargaining, and so the wage share grows more slowly, which is in that line above, or actually falls depending on other concrete factors. And you need to know those other factors. You need to know the macro dynamics, so to speak. But this curve basically says you're moving up and down a structural relation. And the implications for employment and all of that depend on the macro side, which I develop in the book in some detail. I don't think, I mean, it would be lovely if higher productivity meant that people would have to work less and therefore would be better off. I really don't see that, maybe because I live in the US and I can see the displaced people and see how angry and upset and how right-wing they are. And I don't see there's any, with the welfare state gone, which our welfare state was essentially, if not destroyed, greatly reduced by Reagan in the 1980s, those people are really suffering. They are unable to keep their houses. Sometimes they can't feed themselves. Don't forget, we don't have medical care. If you are in Obamacare, you're paying a huge amount of money, but Obamacare was new. Before that, there wasn't anything. That means that people who fall out of the system really fall in a very bad way, a terrible way. And I don't see any likely change in the near future for the restoration of the kind of power that labor has in other advanced capitalist countries. And I see, on the contrary, a movement on those other countries towards a smaller welfare state and a more powerful capitalist sector. So we may be pointing the way, and that's obvious in Brexit and all of that. I don't know where it's going to go, and I don't believe it's determined. Some structural relations are determined. Where we are on this curve, so to speak, is a political one. So I do believe it's possible to reverse that, but keeping in mind the costs and consequences of attempting to do so.
You have interpreted this primarily in terms of institutions, and you did not say much about the coincidence with structural changes, that is the transition from manufacturing to the service economy and the new technology. Isn't that of at least equal importance?
I don't think so. You know, the original Phillips curve was an idea, an empirical finding of Phillips, which if I plot the rate of change of money wages on the vertical axis instead of the rate of changes of wage share and unemployment here, Phillips found if you adjust for cycles, you get this downward sloping curve through a period of extensive social institutional changes. So I was looking to see what Phillips' question was, and reposing it this way, I find the same thing. It doesn't seem to depend on that. One could argue that it is in that first curve and the second curve, these factors appear, but I don't see it as the manufacturing to service shift, because that takes place right where the first curve is still holding. And it doesn't seem to have any impact really on that. I see it in an old-fashioned sociological way as the balance of power between capital and labor and the influence of unemployment on bargaining. Remember, bargaining takes place at the factory floor level, shop level. It's not, at least in the US, done collectively. So that means that this is micro-level influence. There's a whole bunch of studies by Blanchflower and Oswald called the wage curve. And what they do is ask what determines the real wage, and they put in a huge number of variables. These are panel studies, cross-section time series, and they show that institutions and where you are, the state, the location, all of that matters, but unemployment always has a negative coefficient. As higher the unemployment level, the real wage is lower. And that finding they show is robust across many different countries and many different locations. That's what I call the reserve army of labor effect. And this is a way of looking at that effect. Perhaps it won't hold in the future, perhaps it'll fall apart, but you know, from 49 to 2011 is a pretty long run, and I can easily explain from political and historical fact why the curve shifted the way it did. So I think as economists we do look for patterns. We look for stable patterns. We have to explain them then if we find them. And there are many in this book. I show you many stable patterns which are quite striking. I haven't said a word yet about econophysics, but I'm waiting for someone to ask me so I can do it, because there are wonderful stable patterns there too.
All right, is there another question? Because we are close to the end of our time. Yes, please.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you very much. I would like to ask you about your opinion. When we will see the next financial crisis will be take place. What's your opinion on that? Because we see a lot of leverage in the market, a lot of booms. So when will that bubble burst next? Thank you very much.
Yeah, it's a question I worry about a lot. George Soros is a person with some degree of understanding of markets, and he believes that we are sitting on the edge of another crisis. In this case, precipitated by the fact that the original crisis was not solved in the typical way. See, I argue in the book that capitalism solves crises. It does so in its own brute force way. It gets rid of firms, it gets rid of jobs, it weakens labor, it causes weaker firms to be taken over by bigger firms. That's concentration, centralization, destruction of capital value, unemployment, all those phrases that Marx and many others in that tradition talk about. So the trouble is that we are in an era where the state is supposed to not permit that to happen. That's its job, thanks to Keynes. So therefore the state intervenes to prevent the financial markets from collapsing. The bigger capitals, too big to fail, are not allowed to collapse. At least the stronger labor force sectors, like the workers in the automobile industry, are not allowed to suffer the same pain. But that suffering is a restorative mechanism in capitalism. Obviously, I'm not in favor of it, but that's how it restores. And if that's blocked, then you have a stretching out of the recovery and the possible second heart attack, because we haven't changed the problem. The second heart attack comes because the first one was not addressed. That could come about if what's happening with Greece. It could happen from all the political movements and the move to the market, which is clearly happening, could happen from Trump. I don't know the answer to that, but I think there's a real probability, a real possibility of another crisis, financial crisis coming fairly soon. I have no clue as to what you could do about it, to be honest. The people who run these things don't talk to me, and I probably wouldn't be able to tell them anyway, so it didn't matter.
Well, thank you very much. I think our time is over, and it has been extremely interesting, very rich, but also a little strenuous. And I thank you especially for having made this effort after a long flight, and I thank the audience for an interesting discussion.
Thank you.
I don't know whether you have to add something to our general thanks.
The microphone? Yeah, okay. Yeah, just wanted to again say thank you, so maybe we can just give it a I just wanted to invite you again for the workshop tomorrow. You find the details again on the website. So welcome to come and also join our initiative, which meets regularly on Tuesday. And thank you very much for coming. And you find all the information, the stream, and everything from that. Thank you very much.
I'll do econophysics tomorrow, I promise.